happening to us, Iverson? I hear them whispering. I can't tell what is real anymore.
If we lose the charts, we lose everything.
Please, let me survive this.
What if I told you that you could go on a short expedition and disappear for 2 years, forgotten by everyone? Two men, Ejnar Mikkelsen and Ejnar Iverson, found themselves in an icy desert where their only companions were frost, despair, and the ghosts in their own minds. This is not a story about conquering the Arctic, but about how the Arctic almost conquered them. Their ship sank, the crew was rescued, and they were left alone. They had a mission, but the price of completing it turned out to be unimaginable. They had to survive in an ice hut when the whole world had already written them off as dead. It was adrift not only in the ice, but also on the brink of madness. They spent more than 2 years in isolation, battling nature in their own minds. This story of survival was almost lost, but it shows what a person is capable of when they have nothing left but hope. Watch the video to the end to find out how 2 explorers survived in an icy hell and what absurd decision saved their sanity when reality began to crumble. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of this expedition because its true purpose was not just discovery. In 1909, Danish explorer Ejnar Mikkelsen set off for Greenland on a small ship called the Alabama. Officially, it was for mapping, but in reality, he had a secret mission. He was to find the diaries and evidence of Ludvig Julius Eriksson's lost expedition. The thing is, Julius Eriksson was rumored to have found a strait separating Greenland from the so-called Peary Land, which called into question American territorial claims. At stake was sovereignty over a huge part of the Arctic. Mikkelsen had to find evidence that Greenland was a single island, and that evidence was buried somewhere in the ice along with the dead explorers. There was one person on Mikkelsen's team who was not a polar explorer, ship mechanic Ejnar Iverson. He joined the expedition almost by accident, but it was his calmness and technical skills that would prove decisive in this story. Iverson was the complete opposite of the impulsive and mission-obsessed Mikkelsen. From the outset, the Alabama expedition faced harsh conditions. The ice was relentless. The ship struggled northward along the east coast of Greenland. Mikkelsen knew he had only one chance to find traces of Julius Eriksson before their ship was either crushed by ice or forced to turn back. In the fall of 1909, the Alabama dropped anchor off Shannon Island, unable to go any further. The ship was trapped in ice. The crew was forced to spend the winter hundreds of kilometers from the nearest settlement. It was a harsh ordeal, but it was only a prelude to the real drama. Mikkelsen used this winter to prepare for the main expedition. In the spring of 1910, he and Ejnar Iverson were to travel deep into Greenland on dog sleds. It was a journey into the unknown, from which no one had ever returned. They were not seeking glory, but the diary of a dead man. Their task was to cover hundreds of kilometers across an unexplored ice desert. They carried supplies for several months. None of them could have imagined that this one-way trip would stretch into 2 agonizing years. They were prepared for difficulties, but reality exceeded all their expectations. The Arctic is a place where nature does not forgive mistakes, and the price of any oversight is life. Mikkelsen and Iverson took their first step into the icy silence. From the outset, this expedition was an adventure dictated by political ambitions. However, for the people who found themselves in the ice, politics quickly gave way to one question: survival. They did not yet know that their main mission would be accomplished, but the price for it would be exorbitantly high. We are very interested to hear your opinion. Do you think such a risk was justified for the sake of national interests and maps? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the continuation of this incredible story.
We must secure the ship before the light fails.
Are you ready to learn the truth about what they found in the ice? In the spring of 1910, Mikkelsen and Iversen set off on their fateful sledding expedition. They left the relative safety of the ship and ventured deep into the ice sheet. Their destination was a distant fjord where, according to calculations, the last traces of the Mulius-Eriksson expedition were to be found. The journey was incredibly difficult. The temperature rarely rose above -30 degrees. Every kilometer of the journey was extremely difficult. They struggled with the piercing wind, deep snow, and the constant risk of falling into ice crevasses. The dogs, their only source of traction, were getting weaker every day. Supplies had to be strictly rationed. Mikkelsen and Iversen knew they had no room for error. There might be no way back if they miscalculated their strength. They followed a route that was only a guess. They looked for stone cairns, small pyramids of stones that explorers left as landmarks and mailboxes. It was in one of these cairns that they made their most important discovery. Inside the stonework lay a small bundle. It contained the last notes of Jørgen Brynlund, one of the participants in the Mulius-Eriksson expedition. He was the last survivor of the group, and with his last ounce of strength, he made it to this place to leave evidence of their fate. The notes contained all the information Mikkelsen was looking for. There was evidence that Mulius-Eriksson had indeed found the strait, and a map proving that Greenland was a single island. The mission was accomplished. The Danish flag could now rightfully fly over this land. But the discovery was not only a triumph, but also a tragedy. Brynlund's diary described in detail their desperate struggle for life and how they passed away one by one. Mikkelsen and Iversen stood in the middle of the silent desert, holding the last goodbye from their predecessors in their hands. They were shocked, but there was no time for reflection. They themselves had a long and dangerous journey back to the Alabama ahead of them. They took the valuable diaries and maps and turned their sled south. They were sure that the worst was behind them. Their journey had been at the limit of human endurance. They had covered more than 1,000 kilometers across one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. They had accomplished what was considered impossible. Now a ship, a warm cabin, and a homecoming as heroes awaited them. However, the Arctic had not yet had its final say. It had prepared a test for them that would make this sled journey seem like a walk in the park. What could be the worst disappointment awaiting an explorer returning from a difficult expedition? But no one guessed that the real challenge was not the ice, but what awaited them at the ship's mooring. In the next chapter, we will see how triumph turned to despair.
We need to rest the dogs soon.
We are close.
What they discovered when they returned to the coast was beyond comprehension. After months of superhuman effort, Mikkelsen and Iversen had finally reached the point where they had left their ship, the Alabama. They walked anticipating rest, hot food, and safety. But all that awaited them was a pile of wreckage frozen into the ice. The ship had been crushed by pack ice. The powerful pressure had simply broken the hull like a matchbox, and the Alabama sank. It was a disaster. All their hopes for rescue, their floating home, their connection to the world, all of it now lay at the bottom of the icy bay. As it turned out later, the rest of the crew, having waited for Mikkelsen and Iversen longer than agreed, decided that they had perished. When a whaling ship passed by, the Alabama crew seized their chance of rescue and evacuated, leaving a note about what had happened. They could not have known that two of their comrades were still alive. Mikkelsen and Iversen were left alone, completely alone for thousands of kilometers around. They had no ship, no communication, and almost no supplies. The world considered them dead. At that moment, the mission, the maps, the politics, all of it lost all meaning. They had only one task before them: to survive. But how could they survive in the Arctic without equipment or support? Ivar Iversen, a calm and level-headed mechanic, did not let despair take hold of them. He suggested using the only thing they had left, the wreckage of their lost ship. They decided to build a hut from the remains of wood washed ashore. It was their only chance to survive the coming polar night. They worked as long as daylight allowed, pulling pieces of wood, parts of the hull, and anything else that might be useful out of the icy water. Their hut was a small bastion of civilization amid the chaos. It was only a few meters long and wide, barely taller than a person. But in this icy hell, it was their fortress. They moved the remaining supplies they had been able to salvage from the ship into it. There was a lot of work to do. They had to gather fuel for the long winter, hunt to replenish their meager food supplies, and constantly repair their shelter, which could not fully protect them from the Arctic winds. Iverson showed remarkable ingenuity, creating the necessary tools from the debris. They were cut off from the world. Their triumph in finding the Mulius Eriksson diaries now seemed like a cruel irony. They had brought news of the lost expedition, only to find themselves in the same situation. They were an engineer and a researcher trapped in an icy prison. They had no choice but to accept the rules of this cruel game. The polar night lay ahead, and it was only the beginning of their 2-year drift on the brink of life and death. Their small house, cobbled together from debris, became their world. This structure was not just a shelter from the cold, but also the first absurd decision that helped them stay sane. They created order where chaos reigned. Like this video if you also believe that ingenuity is the main weapon in the fight for life.
Why won't you listen? He doesn't understand that we have to wait right here.
Guess what happened next when the polar night set in? The first winter in isolation tested not so much their physical strength as their psychological resilience. Mikkelsen and Iverson found themselves trapped in darkness that lasted for months. The outside temperature dropped to unimaginable levels, and their small hut barely retained the little heat they could generate. The days merged into one endless cycle, getting up in the dark, lighting an improvised stove, eating a meager breakfast, checking traps, repairing equipment, and then darkness again. Routine became their salvation. They forced themselves to work, to do something, just so they wouldn't sit idly by and let their thoughts drift into dark places. They had a limited supply of kerosene for the lamp. They conserved it as best they could, spending most of their time in semi-darkness. In this semi-darkness, reality began to distort. The silence of the icy desert weighed heavily on their ears, interrupted only by the howling wind and the crackling of ice. As the leader of the expedition, Mikkelsen felt a tremendous responsibility. In his diaries, he described how difficult this forced passivity was for him. He was a man of action, and now he was forced to simply wait. Wait for spring, wait for summer, wait for a ghostly chance of rescue. Iverson, on the contrary, was calm and methodical. He was constantly crafting, repairing, and improving their living conditions. His engineering mind found a way out where the explorer saw only a dead end. This contrast in character, oddly enough, helped them stay afloat. But the long stay in a confined space and constant stress took their toll. They began to disagree. Minor arguments turned into tense silences, which felt even more acute in the small hut. They were the closest people to each other, and at the same time the biggest irritants. They both understood that losing control meant certain death. They had to make a conscious effort to maintain the appearance of normality. They read aloud the few books they had managed to salvage from the ship, played cards, and discussed plans for the future. Food was their main concern. Their supplies, salvaged from the Alabama, were quickly running out. Hunting was their only source of fresh meat, but during the polar night, it was almost impossible. They had to stretch every crumb, every piece of dried meat. When the sun finally returned, it was like being reborn. They emerged from their hut, emaciated, pale but alive. The first winter was over. They had survived, but this was only the beginning. In the summer of 1911, they waited to be rescued. They went ashore and stared at the horizon for hours, hoping to see the smoke of a whaling ship. But the sea was empty. No ship approached their shore that summer. Could they have prepared for such an outcome? In the next chapter, you will learn how triumph turned into disaster in an instant. The second winter arrived. The realization that they would have to spend another year in this icy prison was a crushing blow. Their supplies were almost gone. Their clothes and equipment were worn out. Their physical strength was leaving them, but the worst blow was to their psyche. It was during this second, even more terrible winter that the hallucinations began. The line between reality and imagination began to blur. Their brains, exhausted by hunger, cold, and isolation, began to play cruel tricks on them. They both suffered from what is known as Arctic insanity. Mikkelsen later described how they heard voices. It seemed to them that guests were coming to their hut. They had long conversations with these ghosts, argued, and tried to prove something. Iverson, a man with nerves of steel, suddenly began talking to an empty corner. The most vivid and painful hallucination was the ghost ships. They constantly imagined that they heard the horn of a steamboat. They jumped out of the hut into the bitter cold, ran to the shore, shouted and waved their arms, but the horizon was empty. This happened again and again, exhausting their last reserves of mental strength. Their relationship reached a breaking point. They began to suspect each other. Mikkelsen thought that Iverson was plotting against him, hiding food. Iverson thought that the captain had gone mad and was a threat. They were on the verge of doing something irreparable. In this critical situation, Mikkelsen made the very absurd decision that saved them. To combat illusions, he suggested creating their own controlled illusion. They decided to host dinner parties. Every evening at the same time, they took out their best, albeit torn, clothes. They set an improvised table and placed empty tin cans instead of plates. They pretended to have a luxurious dinner with several courses, wine, and cigars. They engaged in small talk, discussed politics and art, and reminisced about restaurants in Copenhagen. They addressed each other as Mr. Iverson and Captain Mikkelsen. It was a theater of the absurd, performed by two exhausted people at the end of the world. But this ritual worked. It gave them structure, a reason to communicate that wasn't about survival or mutual recriminations. It created an island of civilization and common sense amid the icy madness. They countered the chaos in their heads with their own orderly delusions. This psychological trick, this game of normality, helped them hold on. They learned to distinguish their planned fantasies from dangerous, spontaneous hallucinations. They fought madness with its own weapons. It was the longest and most terrifying battle of their lives. They were not fighting nature, but themselves. And in this battle, they were slowly but surely winning. They lived to see the spring of 1912, having spent a total of more than 2 years in isolation. What if I told you that salvation came when they had given up waiting for it? In the spring of 1912, Mikkelsen and Iverson were at their wits' end. 2 years and 2 months of isolation, or 865 days, had turned them into shadows. Their health was undermined, but their spirit, tempered in the struggle against ghosts, was not broken. They left their hut as soon as the weather permitted. They had one last plan. They knew it was useless to wait by the sea. They had to move towards salvation themselves. They gathered the last remnants of their equipment and decided to head south, towards the known whaling bases. It was a desperate move. They had almost no food. They were weak. But the alternative was to stay in the hut and wait for the inevitable end. They chose to fight, even if it was hopeless. Their journey was slow and painful. Every step was difficult. They no longer hoped for a miracle. They just walked because it was the only thing they could do. They walked past the places where they imagined ghost ships. And then on one summer day, July 19th, 1912, the unbelievable happened. Smoke appeared on the horizon. At first, they thought it was another hallucination. They had been deceived so many times that they were afraid to believe their eyes. But the smoke did not disappear. It was getting closer. It was the Norwegian whaling bark Sjöblomsten. The captain of the ship happened to notice 2 strange people on the shore who were desperately signaling. He ordered a boat to be lowered. The sailors who rowed to the shore did not immediately recognize these two creatures as human beings. Before them stood two ragged, unshaven men with wild eyes dressed in tatters. Mikkelsen and Iversen were barely alive. Their long Arctic voyage was over. Their rescue was like a dream. A warm cabin, hot food, human speech. It all seemed unreal after 2 years spent together in the icy wilderness. They couldn't believe that their ordeal was over. Ejnar Mikkelsen and Ivar Iversen returned to a world that had long since buried them. They brought with them not only their lives, but also the priceless Mulius Eriksson diaries, which they had guarded like the apple of their eye for 2 years. Their mission, despite everything, had been accomplished. They spent 865 days in isolation. This record of survival in the Arctic became legendary. But at what cost did they achieve this survival? In the next chapter, we will find out what awaited the heroes upon their return home. The homecoming was not as triumphant as they had expected. Denmark greeted them with restraint. The world had changed during the 2 years they had spent in the ice. Their story seemed incredible, almost fictional. Many initially doubted the veracity of their account. The hardest part was the physical and mental exhaustion. The Arctic had left an indelible mark on them. The cold and meager food had undermined their health, but the psychological scars were much worse. They both struggled with the effects of Arctic madness for a long time. Mikkelsen also had to deal with bureaucratic difficulties. He was accused of losing the Alabama and exceeding his authority. He had to spend a long time proving that his actions were justified. The diaries and maps he had saved became his main argument. It was these documents obtained at such an incredible cost that became the main result of the expedition. They finally confirmed that Greenland is a single island. The territorial dispute with the United States was resolved in favor of Denmark. Mikkelsen's mission, although it turned into a personal tragedy, was of great national importance. Ivar Iversen, a modest mechanic, was awarded for his bravery. He proved that calmness and engineering ingenuity are no less important than polar experience for survival in the Arctic. His contribution to the rescue was invaluable. Mikkelsen later described all their adventures in the book Lost in the Ice. The book became a global bestseller and a classic of polar literature. In it, he candidly recounted not only the physical hardships, but also the psychological struggles, hallucinations, and how they staged dinners to save their sanity. This story is not about heroism in the usual sense. It is not a story about conquering peaks or discovering new lands. It is a story about how two people found themselves at the bottom of an icy pit and managed to get out of it not through physical strength, but through strength of spirit. They did not defeat the ice or the cold. They defeated the despair and madness within themselves. Their absurd decision to have imaginary dinners turned out to be the most effective cure for loneliness and fear. Their survival was a miracle, but it was a miracle created by their own hands. They proved that human ingenuity and the will to live can do incredible things, even when the whole world thinks you're dead. For many years, the story of the Alabama expedition remained in the shadow of other, more sensational polar dramas. It was too strange, too psychological for the heroic era of polar exploration, but its significance only grew over time.
We must document the change.
It showed the world that the Arctic is not just a physical obstacle, but also a powerful psychological pressure. Mikkelsen and Iversen were among the first to describe so candidly the mental problems faced by explorers in extreme isolation. Their experience in combating hallucinations and maintaining sanity through rituals formed the basis of many modern methods of training psychologists for astronauts, submariners, and polar explorers. It turned out that playing normal is a powerful tool for survival in abnormal conditions. The very hut they built from the wreckage of the Alabama stood in the ice of Greenland for many decades. It became a kind of monument to their incredible resilience. Other expeditions found it, read the notes they left behind, and marveled at how two people could have survived there. The value of the Mullius Arison diaries they saved was undeniable. The scientific and cartographic data collected at the cost of the lives of that expedition and at the cost of 2 years of Mikkelsen and Iverson's lives completed the map of Greenland and changed the political landscape of the Arctic. Ejnar Mikkelsen lived a long life and became one of the most respected figures in Denmark, a true Arctic legend. He continued to explore Greenland until the end of his days, but never again exposed himself to such risk. He knew the true price of ice. What allowed these two to survive where other, more experienced and better equipped expeditions had perished? The answer lies not in equipment, but in psychology and the unique partnership between two very different people. The first lesson is the power of routine. In conditions where every day is like the one before, and there is no hope, it is precisely a strict daily routine that keeps the mind from falling apart. Mandatory exercise, cleaning equipment, dinner parties, all this created a framework that kept their psyche intact. The second lesson is ingenuity. Ivar Iverson, a mechanic, proved invaluable in this situation. He could make something out of nothing. He repaired the stove, made traps, and improved their hut. This ability to solve specific, practical problems was no less important than the will to live. The third lesson is acknowledging the problem. Mikkelsen did not ignore the hallucinations or consider them a sign of weakness. He recognized that their minds were in danger and began to actively fight it. His theater of the absurd was not madness, but a method of psychotherapy. The fourth and perhaps most important lesson is the power of partnership. Mikkelsen and Iverson were completely different. One was a driven leader, the other a calm performer. In any other situation, they might not have found common ground, but in the icy hut, they became the perfect complement to each other. They were able to get through the most difficult moments, through quarrels and mutual suspicions, and not lose respect for each other. They understood that they could not survive alone. Their survival was a shared victory, where each person's contribution was equally important. The story of Ejnar Mikkelsen and Ivar Iverson is not just an Arctic adventure, it is a parable of human resilience. They set out in search of a lost expedition, but ended up finding the most hidden corners of their own consciousness. Their drift was not only physical, they were not trapped in the ice on a ship like many others. They were washed ashore, but their consciousness continued to drift between reality and madness, and they were able to return from this drift. They proved that the most terrible enemy in the Arctic is not cold, hunger, or the dangers of ice. The most terrible enemy is loneliness, despair, and the silence that drives you mad. And they found a weapon against this enemy.
Even if it's just lies.
Their weapons were routine, work, humor, and oddly enough, imagination. They did not allow their imagination to destroy their minds, but channeled it into a safe outlet by creating their own little theater. It was their way of controlling the uncontrollable. This expedition, which began as a political adventure, turned into an existential drama. It showed that in extreme situations, all titles, ranks, and goals lose their meaning. All that remains is bare life and the will to live it. Mikkelsen and Iverson returned to the world as different people. They looked beyond the limits of human capabilities and saw that there, in the darkness, one can find not only horror, but also incredible strength. Strength that allows a person to remain human. We have told you the story of Ejnar Mikkelsen and Ivar Iverson, the story of their incredible 865-day drift on the brink of life and death. They set out in search of the truth buried in the ice and almost became part of this icy desert themselves. Their victory was not over the elements, but over their own despair.
I'm here.
This story proves that human ingenuity and psychological resilience are the most important tools in any expedition, even the most hopeless. They didn't just survive, they preserved their sanity by turning their madness into a tool for salvation. Which survival technique do you think was more important for their rescue? Iverson's engineering ingenuity or Mikkelsen's psychological theater? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments section. Which forgotten heroes or incredible expeditions would you like to learn about? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel.